Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Nicole, and I'm director here at Spike Island. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this evening's event, where we're celebrating the launch of this beautiful monograph, hot off the press, published to coincide with the first European survey of Donald Locke's work. This event also marks the closing weekend of the exhibition, which will travel to Ikon Gallery in Birmingham this autumn and Camden Art Centre in London next year. This book is significant in that it is the first to really offer an in-depth exploration of Locke's life and expansive practice, charting the development of his work across 3 continents in 6 decades. We're really proud to have been able to generate new scholarship around his work through a series of newly commissioned essays by curator Grace Aneiza Ali, curator Gina Buenfeld-Murley, artist Eddie Chambers, and art historian Giulia Smith, alongside an extended introduction by Robert Leckie. The book also features full color plates of the artist's work, rarely seen material from the artist's archive, and a comprehensive and richly illustrated chronology. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to pick up a copy for the special exhibition price of £25. And that special price is only available for the next few days before the exhibition closes. The book was a truly collaborative endeavor, and I'd like to thank our partners at Ikon and Camden and the editorial supergroup that helped shape it. Also to Brenda Locke for her incredible generosity with her time, materials, and knowledge, and for her endless patience with all of our requests and questions, and to the London-based design studio Wolfe Hall for their thoughtful approach to the design of this book. We're also grateful to all the contributors and to the lenders to the exhibition who granted permission to reproduce their works in the book. And finally, the book would not have been possible without the generous support of the Paul Mellon Centre, Alison Jakes, and the estate of Donald Locke. So we truly hope that this book serves Donald's legacy in the way we all hoped it will. This evening, we're joined by art historian Giulia Smith, who contributed a wonderful essay on Locke's plantation series. Hew Locke, who grew up around his father's work and is, of course, now an internationally renowned artist in his own right. And Robert Leckie, curator of the exhibition, my predecessor here at Spike Island, and now director of Gasworks in London. Before I hand over to Robert, just a few obligatory housekeeping notes. The nearest toilets are located just through the doors that you entered through and down the hallway to the right. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, please leave the building through the main entrance. The event is being filmed and photographed, so if you prefer not to be captured, please just make that known to one of my colleagues around the room. And finally, just a reminder that we're a safe space here, so please do keep any comments considerate and respectful. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's such a pleasure to be here with Hew and Giulia in amongst some of Donald's truly impressive works from the 1990s. And it's great to have such different perspectives on Donald's work represented in the room. So obviously, as Nicole mentioned, Hew really grew up around Donald and his work, and so brings that unique perspective as someone who's directly related to the artist, but also whose work is in some senses informed by Donald's own. And then Giulia, who really has come to the work at a later stage as an art historian, and who is really making a significant contribution to really rethinking and shaping the discourse on Donald's work from a contemporary perspective today. So it's a real pleasure to have both these points of view represented, and I hope it will be a lively conversation. Also, it's nice to keep things informal, so if anybody does have any questions at any point, please do raise your hands. But I'll start with some questions of my own. And my first is for Hew, and it's really just to say that I'm sure that you were aware of Donald's passion for art from a very young age, but as an artist yourself, or as a young person, what was the first time that you really felt like you got it?
First of all, can people hear me? Okay, good. Right. In 1989 was the Other Story exhibition. I finished art school in 1988, and I went to the opening of this show, The Other Story, which was a seminal show, important show at the Hew Gallery. One of the best things about it was the fact that I shocked my dad by being much taller than him. He was a bit traumatized by that, but that's another thing. But then I went up to see the work, and I was like, oh shit, this guy is actually good, you know? And I'd been to art school, so I was educated, you know? And it was impressive. The thing I liked before that was seeing photographs of the black squares in Arizona. And these things which looked like black holes in the desert. I thought that was extraordinary. But definitely it was the Other Story exhibition, which I just thought, it was a great show, but his work, I walked away and thought, you know, this guy is actually really rather good. And this stuff which I just thought of as being this bunch of weirdness, you know, is actually proper stuff, you know.
And I remember speaking to Brenda about how you and Donald would stay in touch, even when you were living at opposite ends of the Atlantic, and you would have these long phone calls where you'd talk relatively regularly about work in depth. So if that moment in '89, where you have actually works predominantly from the '70s that were on display in that show, is kind of the first moment of beginning to understand the work. How did that relationship or that understanding develop over the years following?
Well, it developed in the fact that he became, along with my wife, Indrakana, he became my main confidant about art, because he was somebody who understood where I was coming from completely. I didn't have to explain things to him. And he would talk passionately about Guyanese art and Guyanese approaches to art, and then also how on earth such a small country produced such significant artists. But he was a real great support, that's for sure. And then we would talk about spaghetti westerns and kung fu films. You know, I mean, we would move from talking about Cézanne and all that to talking stupidness. And I still like people who can operate like that. You go high and you can come down real low, you know.
And Giulia, to bring you in, when did you first encounter Donald's work?
Well, I was thinking about that question, and I'm not sure about a distinctive eureka moment. I think I saw trophies of empire several times at the Tate, and I think my story is quite useful for maybe mapping a kind of institutional history approach to Donald Locke of the last sort of 20 years. So I think that work has been quite visible in the UK, and I was writing about other Guyanese artists, and I knew that I wanted to bring Donald in the conversation, and I was writing primarily about approaches to environment, shaped by the experience of growing up in Guyana. And so I went to see the work in Atlanta, went to see the estate, let's say. And so for me, it was more about encountering this sort of exhilarating amount of stuff, just beautiful, gorgeous sculptures, works on paper, unfinished material, broken or disassembled material in mint condition on the walls, on the floors, just really literally everywhere. And so I think that shaped the way that I've been writing about the work in terms of a certain joy in creation and a certain, just the scale, the quantity, and really the kind of exhilarating nature of it rather than the single object on a pedestal.
And obviously your essay for the book focuses on the plantation series. So at what point did you kind of focus in your interest on that particular body of work?
But to be honest, I think that I was constantly asked to write about that body of work, and I still slightly I want to write about other works as well. So part of the way that I look at the plantation studies is through Donald Locke's lifelong interest in materiality and this very embodied and joyful engagement with the material. He talked about sculpting with clay in terms of tactile titillation. So this real sense of pleasure and exploration of material that then connects for me with the later works and how he was using wood and making assemblages. So for me, it's all connected, and that's what I've tried to bring into the reading of the plantation studies, looking at them more in terms of their, eclecticism and just the sort of bonkers stuff that he was putting inside his sculptures. And rather than me specifically wanting to write only about that body of work, I found, and this is why I appreciate this exhibition, because I found there's been a tendency to constantly bring back those works specifically in UK displays, which I think belies a kind of default framework, default mode of working, where it's sort of easier for galleries and museums to work with very formalist pieces of sculpture that have a kind of language of geometric abstraction that's easily readable within a Western or North Atlantic canon, and maybe gloss over this stuff that is more idiosyncratic and interesting in different ways.
Yeah, Hew, I wonder if you want to pick up on this idea that Giulia's talking about in terms of your own perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of see you got a point there, because I think that's true as well. I mean, it's taken so long to get people to really get this work. I mean, in 2009, my wife Indra Khanna put on a survey show of the last 10 years, a comprehensive survey show, including works similar to the works in this room here. And it was really difficult to get people interested in them. Whereas if you do some squares and stuff, I'm being so harsh here, but things change. Artists evolve, artists change, and sometimes you're ahead of your public. You know what I mean? That's what can happen. But talking about the plantation series, that was him. That was a very real thing. I mean, every time he came back to Guyana, we'd go to the plantations. We'd stand up on the side. We'd watch the punts bringing the cane in. He'd go and hang out with cane cutters. And so all that is reduced to this formal thing, which they're wonderful works. But then the work in this room here is much more visceral, I feel personally, It's just different work.
Yeah.
And both of them is valid.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a statement that Donald wrote in 2010, that was the year he died, that's always fascinated me. It's something that I quote in my contribution to the book. And he says, and I quote, "It takes my breath away to find that from the moment I arrived in London," which was, for the record, in 1971, even as I argued that art was a function of plastic purposes, I was neck deep in the Afro-Caribbean stream of consciousness that was profoundly affecting everything I did. And what stuns me even more now is that this was crystal clear to other artists. The plantation pieces, black paintings, black ceramics, the search for black skin, and the mounted bullets were grounded in the very anti-plasticism I was denying. So there's something fascinating for me in that quote in terms of Donald kind of reckoning with, at a later stage, something that he didn't see or understand in his own work, perhaps at the time it was being made.
And that was what I saw in the other story. After I'd written what for me in those days was a radical thesis, and taking all sorts of complex ideas of race and post-colonial history and stuff like that. And I went to see the show and thought, shit, this is a black artist in the 1970s. That's what this work is fundamentally about. A personal experience, made formal, but personal experience.
And did you talk to him about that at the time?
Yeah, but I mean, so I'm laughing because I remember 2009, as I said, Indra organizes this show at New Art Exchange in Nottingham. Gets David A. Bailey, great curator, along to do In Conversation. Boy, if you see my father dodge and dive and stuff like that, not giving clear answers to anything, you know. So he, and not wanting to be pinned down, you know, and that I understand, that a lot of artists understand, trying not to be pinned down to a specific thing, you know, because it's more complex than that.
Yeah.
So I haven't answered your question, but
No, you did, and I think it really comes back to where Giulia started off, which is talking about how the work is extremely complex, and you see these kinds of what I think of as returns in some of the later work to some of the earlier tendencies or earlier styles of making.
yeah, exactly.
But also, you know, even in terms of like the interpretation of these paintings in this room, there's this desire to kind of know and to understand and categorize exactly what's going on in these paintings. And the truth of it is, because Donald is no longer here, actually it's very difficult to answer some of those questions.
Yes, but the thing is, he may not even be able to answer them himself.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And I think what he would talk, what moving to Atlanta did for him was he said, "You do Hew boy. These people, they need a story. You know, you got you may not tell the story, but it's the land of story tales, storytelling. Sorry."
And I understand he was a great storyteller himself.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah.
Mythical pork knockers and stuff like that. Pork knockers, by the way, are gold prospectors. That's what they're called in Guyana. And it's because they ate salted pork.
Giulia, in your essay, you talk about how Donald was developing an approach to the grid, which really pushed against some of the orthodoxies at the time. Could you expand a little bit on that for us here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to maybe not go at it directly. I loved his writings about teapots. And I was maybe surprised by how much I got into these debates about pottery that shaped his education in the early years of coming to Britain to study at Bath Academy. And he had such an interesting perspective that might seem just simply sane with hindsight, where he was essentially saying, what is this mad dogma about truth to materials and form follow function and all of these kind of little slogans that also shaped the relationship to things like the grid, ideas about abstraction and functionality that were very rooted in a kind of Eurocentric vision of modernism, just seemed slightly baffling. And he wrote in such a sophisticated way about what it meant to come to these discourses from a post-colonial perspective, essentially, and to have that kind of double consciousness of once seeing yourself in the school, absorbing them, being able to use them, and at the same time seeing yourself from outside, almost like an out-of-body experience, and kind of seeing the whole conversation as slightly mad and ridiculous. And I just loved his writing about these kinds of ideas and how they related to conversations about teapots and what made a legitimate teapot in a kind of British pottery school, and how absurd that was, and how that fueled his own desire to really experiment and push form beyond what was acceptable in an ultimately fairly provincial discourse that was quite attached to sort of certain ideas about nation and who gets to say what pottery is and what isn't, what goes in it and what doesn't. And similarly with the grid, I think a lot of what he's doing is, well, okay, I can play with these ready-made forms that are clearly shaping the discourse. I can go beyond them. I can put ceramics and fur and all kinds of things grow, push against them, almost like rise from underneath them and play with them. And at the same time, I can also show you how this very structure is the structure you would see from the air if you were flying over Guyana, and bring the whole history of plantation monocrop agriculture to this set of conversations and really open them up to a kind of global history of economics and social relations that are completely flying over the heads of most of these kind of European circles thinking about grids. So just an extraordinary amount of depth, intelligence, experience, world vision, and just humor. We were reading a review earlier where he was called, his work was described in terms of having a wicked wit, which I thought was really good. Yeah, a long answer.
No, it's good. He also did workshops with kids to make teapots, I believe in the 70s, right, Brenda? In London. So it's something that he also was playing with very materially as well. It's something we talked about trying to recreate here, but didn't actually happen. So maybe you never know, in Birmingham or in London, maybe a teapot workshop for children will happen sooner rather than later. And I think the other thing about his journey with ceramics is how formative the experience in Edinburgh was, which is obviously where he was born, and that's where he encountered peers who were really inspired by the California clay movement, and particularly this guy Peter Volkos, and got to work with these much larger kilns and really play with really throwing all of that dogma that he'd encountered in Bath out of the window to some extent, and really try things. And it feels to me that experimentation is what really begins to materialize much later in the plantation series, where you have, materials that you would just never think would go together, brought together, and the incredible craftsmanship of it all as well. Even looking through the archive in Atlanta, as I know you have, there's lots of bits of works that have been taken apart, reused in other works, which has obviously caused many, many headaches for the estate. But it just demonstrates this constant desire to continue to rethink and rework pieces, but also this desire to also think through making and think through the use of his hands, and through drawing and kind of sketching. So it's kind of fascinating how, even though that experience in Edinburgh happened much earlier, it doesn't really seem to kind of come to the fore until much later. And I guess that's partly because actually after Edinburgh he moved back to Guyana and didn't have access to the facilities to work with clay and be doing that.
Yeah, but he did have a kiln, and the kiln was known as our oven. And one of my earliest childhood memories is the smelling of this stuff cooking in the oven. And it was Sculpty, there's a product called Sculpty or Fimo, kids thing. These large scale sculptures made of this stuff cooking in the oven.
Oh, I love that smell.
It was, that's the smell of my childhood, that is. I mean, ovens are supposed to be for bread and chicken and stuff like that, but very chemically smell as I remember it.
Yeah. And it's interesting also to pull it back to the other story, the fact that I mentioned that the work that was shown there was predominantly from the 70s. And so it didn't really represent the pivot that Donald made in the 80s when he moved to Arizona.
Exactly.
And started working with bronze. And I guess probably that was partly to do with the fact they couldn't afford to ship the work from the US. And they probably worked with what was already here. But
yeah. And that was the only place, because I went to visit my stepmom, Brenda, and my dad in Arizona, and that was the only house I visited. By the way, in Arizona, everybody has barbecues plumbed in, to me, with gas and everything like that. His was used for patinas. No meat was ever cooked in this thing.
But Brenda does say he's a very good cook too, so
he's a bloody good cook. Way better than me. I didn't inherit that.
So in his contribution to the book, again, Eddie talks about this idea of the other story as a point of delayed reception. But as Giulia alluded to earlier, it really is only, arguably since 2009 with the show at New Art Exchange that the work began to be seen here. It entered the Tate collection, I think, in 2015. So it really is a very recent.
It's a recent
history.
thing. I mean, I used to feel, and this is that it was because it was all monochrome and black, no in color. tone. That was what the problem was. It wasn't color, except for blue, or a bit of red. And I used to feel that whether it was something as simple as that made people not see how amazing the work was, you know. And now we live in a more complex world, and people are much more open to things. You know, hence a great review in The Guardian. I've got to say that, folks, good review.
Yeah, and Giulia, from an art historical perspective, thinking about this kind of recent resurgence of interest in Donald's work, I know that you're also working on a book about art in Guyana more broadly, and thinking through the environment and also kind of colonial history specifically. So could you talk about how you situate Donald's work in that wider project? And maybe, because obviously this is a monograph, and it really is trying to think through his journey as an artist, and it's not so much about his dialogue with people who are his peers and contemporaries, that maybe is something that you're looking into.
Well, the piece of writing that I found most useful when I was framing my book is actually written by Donald. He wrote it, I believe, not long after the other story. He started writing a book at some point in the 90s. Someone else here might know the exact date, but a book called The Unknown Shore, which was about the arts of Guyana, or artists from Guyana. And I mean, part of the reason for writing the book was a level of dissatisfaction with the other story, and also with an exhibition that Aubrey Williams had at the Whitechapel around the same time in the late 80s. And he really felt that this question of why there are so many talented, influential artists coming out of Guyana hadn't been addressed in a systematic way, and this sort of deserved attention on its own terms. And part of his argument was because the work was dealing with this sort of world-building histories of catastrophic environmental management in a way that no artists from other countries could not quite do on the same terms. Or there was something unique about, I think, especially the contrast between this very strict grid of plantations on the coast and the interior of the country being extraordinarily diverse and a kind of biodiverse, but also having a large stretch of Amazon rainforest, that made this a context that was very unique for thinking about that conflict between a kind of romantic vision of a world beyond the reach of capitalism or colonial capitalism and racial capitalism, and a world that had been so violently imprinted and shaped in order to sustain the plantation economy and ultimately empire in its white supremacist form. And for him, that was something that sort of kind of shaped the aesthetic sensibilities of Guyanese people in an almost unconscious way. And it was a kind of red thread that connected a lot of different artistic practices that might look formally different coming out of Guyana, but share many of these themes. And so he was really thinking about the grid as a specifically Guyanese aesthetics. He talked about it in terms of the box, and also wrote about the contrast between the bush and the box, which was incredible in terms of really appropriating these kind of aesthetic categories that had organized the way in which modern art had been talked about for almost a century, and reorienting them towards this post-colonial project, and specifically Guyanese post-colonial project. And that's, I still find that text is really extraordinary to think with, and I go back to it and it's helped me frame my book. And I think, of course, these themes resonate in a very particular way with conversations that have become very urgent in the last 10 to 20 years around ecological catastrophe, environment, but also anti-racism, and the two combined together. I guess that kind of junction, to use the kind of terms that become very current in academia, I guess, the kind of intersection between decolonial and ecological thinking. And I think it's pretty extraordinary the way he was thinking about it as early as the 90s, and always through a very keen visual aesthetic perception. So not with philosophical jargon, with a really beautiful way of telling the stories of the architecture of Guyana and the experience of living in this environment on a kind of phenomenological, deep bodily level, and this kind of psychic unconscious being shaped by these grids. Just amazing imagery. So that's how I came to it, and I think maybe it represents something about the interest of historians of my generation and why it's become so. Maybe we become more responsive to the work.
And Hew, obviously, your work also deals very explicitly with histories of empire, but arguably takes quite a different form to the work of your dad. And so, can you talk a little bit about how you feel Donald's work has influenced your own, or?
Well, he would put my work into context, which was, I didn't always agree, but it was kind of helpful. So Hew, these drawings you're doing, these are part of the Guyanese black and white tradition, and the thing is, he was right. You know, there's a particular black and white tradition of art, people doing pen and ink drawings and stuff like that, which we're talking about post-war, yeah, post-1950s, running up to the 70s, 80s. You know, it was interesting, and it was interesting to feel a place of belonging. But the conversations were wide-ranging, you know what I mean? And it always come back to one thing. Boy, Hew, the thing about Cézanne, and then we'd be off on some weird tangent about Cézanne, you know what I mean? And sorry, what was the question again?
Just how his work has influenced your own.
Sorry?
How Donald's work has influenced your own.
Well, my work is between both my parents. My mother, Giulia Locke, and my father, Donald Locke. And I'm literally in the middle of the two of them. So my work won't look like this, but it will have elements of it for sure. And I would do a drawing and think, no, I like this is my thing. And then I look at the painting he did, which I saw when I was 7 years old. I'm like, shit, you know. Okay, fair enough. But don't worry, Hew, you're better. And there was let me be honest, there was a bit of tension in the relationship, you know, to me, because we're both competing for the same thing, you know, trying to get ahead, you know. And but both with a lot of respect for each other, genuine respect, and genuine excitement about what we were both doing, you know. I miss the dude, man, you know. I really miss the guy, seriously, you know, because what I had was something many artists don't have. You know, you're talking to your your parent, and you're talking about the thing you're both involved in at a very high level, and you both understand where you're coming from, you know. It was special. It was cool. And the work is good.
Yeah, what would be your favorite work if you had to choose one?
Oh, Lord. Throw a coin, man. Toss a coin. I mean, anything from this room here, the piece with the two gourds, the two wooden bowl things, which has this sort of Japanese feel to it, but it's not. I like the pieces with the photographs of people from yearbooks and stuff like that, because I remember him. That reminds me of when he came back to Guyana, and he's collecting these things from newspapers. And why are you collecting that? You know, and then because these were deaths and messages in Guyana, right? As in maybe in other parts of the world, you have your newspaper, and then at the back, at some point, they have decimal so-and-so called Sonny Boy has died, funeral such and such, or cremation at such and such place. And I thought that was too dark, you know, but my dad thought it had something. And I understand now, because if I was living in London, looking back to Guyana, this is what I would have been fascinated by. So I keep looking at these things. Sorry, it's a very weird conversation. I've not done this before. Next time I'll be more prepared.
Not at all. I think the other thing about him is having not met him, which is one of the tragedies for me.
You missed out, boy. You missed out.
as I understand. Also, I think it's fair to say that to an extent his work was never presented in such a kind of total way during his lifetime. He obviously had significant exhibitions where particular bodies of work were shown, but correct me if I'm wrong, Giulia, I don't think there's been a kind of moment to
be fair, there's not been a thing where the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s have all been shown together. I mean, the show that Indra did was wonderful, but this is a different thing, you know. And also, we're in a different moment now. The work can be seen differently, and the work is complex and messy and at times uncomfortable, you know. And that's it, you know. That's. It's a bit like I keep thinking of this. There was an interview I saw years ago, one of these MTV interviews with David Bowie. And he's talking about creativity and saying, you know, when I'm working on something, when I'm in an area, feel where I like, you know, this is uncomfortable. I'm not sure about this at all. That's when I know I'm onto something, you know. And I suppose that's what I think, you know.
Yeah, and I think you can feel that. I mean, even in terms of his own writing, that there's like a level of discomfort or constant working through things. You know, he was
working through things.
He was like the Lord of the Draft, you know, like even with.
No, sure. It's like, no, I mean, lost count, but so many drafts of the same introduction.
Yeah, and that's maybe something that's also perhaps not well represented in a space like this, where it looks like everything is kind of finished. Obviously, if you spend time in the archive, there's poems, and there are like 20 versions.
There's a
of the
whole
same
backstory
poem.
And stuff like that. And what was interesting is to see him living in Atlanta and starting to work about the South and its history, and going out with him to say eat food on a Sunday and seeing people coming in from church and him talking to me about what this is like and stuff. And then realizing from him that the Civil War was yesterday, you know, in cultural terms, you know what I mean? It's yesterday, man. And it fed into the work naturally, you know, and without being forced, if you see what I mean.
No, it's interesting. And I remember he writes about the fact that despite having obviously moved from Guyana to Bath, of all places, in the 1950s, and then gone back to Guyana, come to Scotland, moved to London, been all over, and then going to Arizona. I think it was the move from Arizona to Atlanta.
Yeah.
He talks about as being the most significant period of change in his life, which is kind of fascinating when you think about the ground he's covered.
And what he was saying is that the architecture of Atlanta, you say, Hew, you know, you could glance at these buildings and go, and just for a split second, you're in Guyana, but then it's gone. And it's that elusive thing, which I sometimes see in this work, you know, an elusive nature, trying to find something which is impossible to find, because if you find it, then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the moments of kind of beginning to understand that later work was actually seeing Trophies of Empire 2, and for the very basic reason that obviously it echoes a work from the 70s which felt more familiar in terms of its structure, even though the things that occupy the shelves are so different. And so it's funny how these very minor things can give you away into something, and the more time I spend with that work, the more I find it completely kind of confounding and confusing, but also amazing in terms of how it's dredging up, you know, stories from kind of like his childhood, Guyanese folklore, these kinds of things.
Exactly. And if you notice, some of these figures, I think, have got dreadlocks. He would go up to Rastas, friends, I should hasten to add, right? And say, look, if you ever cut your locks off, can you give them to me, please? So you used to have dibs on people's locks, man, you know? But, and the idea of giving somebody your hair to do something like that, I mean, you know, coming from the Caribbean, that's a bit unnerving.
And so, Giulia, you said before that...
By the way, him asking for somebody's locks, that this was a close friend we're talking about, you know what I mean? But that's a very, very offensive thing to be asking somebody, you know?
I feel a little bit bad that we asked you to write about the Plantation series now that everyone keeps asking you to write about that. So what body of work would you like to write about next, if you were going to write about it next, and why?
I loved writing about the plantation works. They are stunning, and there's so much. They're so compact, and so much you can do with them. So much they open up. I did write more recently something that's going to come out next year about these works, and in a sense, touching on what we just discussed is sort of what kind of time do these work manifest, and Donald's particular approach to history. And yeah, these kind of colliding temporal planes. And I love thinking with these works. I love teaching with these works. I think they are fantastic works to teach world histories with, much better than a kind of linear written account that's in a textbook. They're associative. They allow you to do things that you don't always get to do as a historian who's writing, and work intuitively. And then they have these bulging masses of black that are doing something, they're almost negating the story. And they are so incredibly poetic, and also tell a very distinct story about, I guess subjugation is the way it was put in the text for the exhibition. And but there's always this kind of push and pull, the moment you think you can tell a history of violence, or, there is a points Nazi imagery, there is a points imagery of the Civil War, then there's something else that's going on, and then the story gets pulled apart, and it just feels a lot more realistic as a way of doing history than when you have to pick an argument and kind of follow it.
Exactly. I mean, or realizing that if you can put one image here, another image next to it, it's very different to putting one image here and another image way on this side, what I've liked about this work, and some of the work I've got in my own personal mini collection, is I look at it and think, you know what, Hew, I can't add anything or take anything more away. It's exquisitely unfinished, shall we say,
That's an interesting question. When, sorry, I maybe cut you off there, but yeah, when would he, because of the 25 million drafts of The Unknown Shore, when would he decide it's done? And also because the works, I guess I'm interested in this work also because they archive so much of his own career, so there is often images
and
of
that's what I do like, the fact that he's cannibalizing his own back catalogue, and that gives it an added thing, It gives it does give me an added thing.
And in a sense, it makes me want to also move beyond a narrative around, the work wasn't given the platform it could have been given or it deserved earlier on, because at the same time, he was always showing in really interesting show and had lots of publics.
That's very true.
And he clearly had an incredible confidence as an artist to work very systematically with very clear themes all across his life, really, which is incredible. And also to then reference himself in a way that, he certainly knew he was doing something good, I think. And yeah, that's my impression.
Yeah. In terms of these works particularly, he was obviously at that time, he'd recently moved to Atlanta, and it's when he took on the studio in Nexus. And again, I remember Brenda, who I keep quoting, sorry, she's right there, talking to me about the fact that he would be just constantly working. And I think at that point, Brenda had a day job. And basically, she'd get home, Donald would cook dinner, delicious apparently, and then they'd hang out for an hour or two, and then he'd go to the studio and he'd be there all night. And so he definitely had these moments of like intense focus, and I think you really do see it with this body of work in particular. It's almost like he's constantly working and reworking,
reworking, even when he was not making art. Okay, here's an anecdote for you. One of the worst things that happened to Daddy was Home Depot in the US, which is the major DIY outlet, decided they're going to open 24 hours a day. 4:35 in the morning, my boy walking up and down the aisles, looking at stuff, thinking, "What am I doing here?" I should be at home sleeping or something like that. It's just
What was he looking for?
But just looking for something to make something, you know what I mean? With no purpose in mind, you know, just because it was there, you know, build it and they shall come, you know what I mean? Good Lord, you know. But he used to work, I weaned myself off of it by now, but it took me years to stop this nighttime thing, you know, because it's not healthy, man. You wake up in the morning and you think, what I did last night was really major. And for some artists, it works. And then you look and you think, oh, that was the wrong turn.
I wonder, is it time to open up to questions from the audience? Does anybody have a burning question they would like to contribute? Please. Do we have a mic? Do we need a mic? Thank you, Diana.
These things. Well, is that all right? Okay. Just to pick up on something you talked about earlier on, to me, it's evident from this show that Donald Locke was a relentless experimenter. And I think you did touch on this. But perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more. What was the drive? Why did he prioritize experimentation? If that's a fair point.
No, it's a question. I mean, okay, the work which is not really in here, there's some in the Trophies of Empire too. It would come from inspiration which you can't ignore. There was a show called Souls Grown Deep, and now this is intuitive Southern artists of African American descent, and that had a big impact on them. People like Lonnie Holly, Thornton Dial, so a whole bunch of these guys, and it had a real impact on my dad. There was a show in Atlanta, and he was like, Christ. But then he's not that. He's been to art school. He's come through modernism. He's come through postmodernism and stuff like that. And so the work changed. You know, it changes because you can't control it. It changes because otherwise you get bored and give up. You know what I mean? You know, and I think he was constantly getting excited about this, that, or the other. Like, okay, it's my fault. I take the blame for this. But I was telling him, look, Ma, you don't have to cast everything in bronze because you ain't got the money to do that. Just do it in wax and we'll deal with that later, you know. Sadly, now the estate is having to deal with that problem. So I apologize, Brenda. You know, but we're doing the conversations. I was saying, look, Daddy, the people making work in plaster Paris, they're making work in bread, for God's sake, you know. You don't need to, but the experimentation thing it's inherent, it's innate, it's an uncontrollable thing, and he was very much that, you know, very much an experimenter. I wish I wasn't, but I'm not here to talk about me, thank God.
Yeah, I would also say that I think he maybe answered part of that question with the early morning visits to the DIY store. It sounds a bit like the experimentation was inevitable because he couldn't sleep.
It is inevitable. And because you're constantly trying to make something work. And I'm speaking on his behalf. Sorry, mate, you know, but speaking about, you're trying to make something work. And if it ain't working, you got to do something. Whether it's drop a big blob of something there, drop a bit of fur, put a bit of grill, you know, because otherwise, what's the point? You know what I mean? If you got, that's the best of my answer.
He also wanted to leave it for the art historians to figure out later on, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, on one level, is what a good artist does. I wonder if the training in working with ceramics also played a role in his method, because it's so much trial and error, and he kept really interesting notes about this massive binder or box that's all sort of receipts and notes about the materials he was buying and what he was using and how he was, what temperature he was making sculpture. Essentially, I saw it and I was like, I wish I was actually making so that I could really read the story through these documents. What I see is endless receipts, and I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to leave that box. But I think the fact that he was collecting all of this data to track his process and that he was so prolific with trying out different solutions also had something to do in part with working with materials that were volatile, unpredictable, and he had to work out the right formula, and that got him going. He clearly, that suited him as a way of working.
Yeah, and this was also someone that came to study ceramics on a scholarship in Bath in '54, having never worked with ceramics or clay before. So he was obviously up for a challenge to some extent.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think the ceramics thing, the physical process of making stuff in clay, that is the reason for these works here. That's the reason why the black is textured with sawdust. Thank you very much. I couldn't remember what it was. I kept thinking sand, but it's not sand.
Any other questions?
Okay, because he gave me some to try, as he would. It didn't work for me. That was his thing. Leave it like that. Along with a big pot of blue paint, which you can see around here, that didn't really work for me either. And we realized we're different people, and that's cool.
Quite interesting. Can you imagine if you'd developed the same?
Oh God, that's no. Why we got on? Well, because we liked each other, which helps, But it was that we were both going after the similar thing, but in very different ways, and that was a nice thing, That was a really, really, really nice thing. And then we talked some stupidness. Serious, stupid, serious,
Yeah, my favourite photo of him in the show is the one with him with the spoon on his nose.
Oh, yes, exactly.
Spoons. So many spoons. I'm just looking at it right there, and I always think, okay, excavating.
Yeah. Any other questions? Brenda.
Oh, right. When we talk more competition, you mean? No. My drawing...
Sorry, just for the recording, so that people know, that question was about the difference between Hew and Donald's drawing process.
Okay. My drawings were more pastel-y, mixing layers of grey and stuff like that. My dad's, this is very, very, very basic, simple stuff. My dad's things were very dark, literally dark, and so that was it, basically. I was more, I gotta watch a thunderbolt to come and hit me from the sky, I agreed with you, son, until you veered off the trail, and you start to put me down, I ain't even here to argue my own case, We just had a different approach, a different sensitivity to things, basically. And the difference is very simple. I'm the product of him and my mom. That's it. It's very simple, that. I've been looking at some of his images of Cortez recently, and fish caught in a sort of web of weeds. And I wouldn't have done that. I would have done single figures and the whole thing of a whole world inside a single figure rather than... I can't explain this, man. Sorry, folks. I'm stumbling here, but there we go. I gotta tell you, come back next month, I'll be better.
Let me try and make sense out of this scribble. This is really speculative, but I'm thinking about Donald Locke's early formative period, studying ceramics. And I'm wondering if there might be something quite important about the difference between the discourses in the crafts as opposed to the arts in the post-war, in the US, in the UK, around non-Western culture, that within ceramics, as opposed to, fine art, studio practice, and this is really speculative, but I'm wondering if there wasn't a much more nuanced and sophisticated set of perspectives and relationships with non-Western cultural practice. Here I find myself thinking about Bernard Leach and his really highly kind of integrated collaborations with Japanese ceramicists. And I'm wondering if that mightn't have been maybe really very important in terms of confidence and, in terms of in really subtle ways, a kind of milieu that raised confidence and a sense of the importance of what he was doing. It's, as I say, that's really, speculative and would need a lot of research to back it up.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to answer, but it's a very interesting question. In the conversations that Donald had during his life, he would talk about, as Giulia writes, like this idea of truth materials being very much the kind of dogma. He would talk about Bernard Leach, that was very much kind of gospel in Corsham at the time. And so, in a way, my understanding of the narrative is much more kind of in resistance to those potters at the time, or the kind of the orthodoxies of the time. But I think, potentially you're right that he maybe also took inspiration from this history of working with other cultures and felt a certain freedom in terms of being able to bring different cultural references that weren't perhaps the kind of norm for a tradition in this country at the time to the fore. Yeah. Giulia, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think that from what I understood, his view was that the British approach to pottery in a global tradition was very deeply marked by colonial attitudes. Therefore, certain forms associated, for example, with Japanese ceramics were deemed acceptable and viewed through a lens that wasn't ultimately culturally sensitive, and others were deemed completely beyond the pale and pure kitsch. And all of these hierarchies he was not interested in upholding and was very interested in critiquing, and did so in his writings and in his practice. So I think he was observed a kind of cult of some of these personalities, and I think he probably did take some inspiration where he needed to, but I think he was very skeptical of the kind of dogmas that prevailed, even around the conversation between, around the kind of worldliness of pottery.
What's interesting about this whole thing for me, at a very personal level, is that all these things come, oh yes, I forgot that. My dad used to go and visit a guy called Bahadur. And Bahadur lived in an island called Wakanam. And he ran, and I think my dad helped him with his pottery wheel. And he would basically make what my dad called goblets, but basically drinking vessels and vessels. And he was a traditional ceramicist, making everyday ware, one at a time on a pottery wheel, firing them in a kiln, traditional way, and taking them to India. And as if he was like a traditional village potter from India, basically, but several generations along the line in Guyana. And my dad had a lot of time for this dude because he saw him as a living tradition of something. Of course, you're young, you're not smart enough to realize what's being shown you in front of your eyes. Now this pottery still exists It still is pretty much a similar thing to what it was, but now there are tour guides who can take you there to have a visit, and then people get a bit of money and stuff like that. But Bahadur was a big deal for my dad.
Yeah, he did write about that interestingly as well. He wrote, I don't remember where, but he was writing about this situation he found himself in the late 60s, where he couldn't make ceramics because there was no ceramic tradition in Guyana, because as a colony it'd been developed to produce only a very small array of commodities. So he then sort of launched into a much more wide-ranging reflection about the economies of empire and how alienating and unnatural was this sort of idea of turning an area of the world, a country, into the producer of a single product that then serves into this larger imperial market. And therefore, because there was no need for ceramics coming from Guyana, because the British Empire had no need for that, then there was no ceramic tradition except for this guy. This was his
Exactly. This guy was an anomaly.
Except for that guy.
He stood out, and he would take once a week. He would take his wares to the main market in town, and that was how he made his living.
Although then there's also really a lot of interesting work later on, which the Stephanie Correia, a lot of other.
Oh yes, Stephanie Correia and people. You're quite right. Stephanie Correia, who was an Amerindian indigenous ceramicist in Guyana.
But yeah, that doesn't seem to have come into contact with what your father was doing there in the 60s.
No.
Had this.
I don't think they ever met.
I mean, I think he was pretty good at and pretty had a very critical eye and was looking at all the experiences he was going through in his art practice through the lens of histories of empire and conceptualizing even his relationship to raw material, what was available, what wasn't.
Exactly. And in Guyana, making ceramics would have been difficult because the clay was not really robust enough. So you had to add a lot of grog to it, a lot of sand and stuff. You have to really work it up. It's not the easiest, not the clay you would choose to work in naturally, put it that way. Too much vegetation in it or something like that.
But then,
having said that, the Amerindians made amazing stuff historically pre-Columbian. So forget what I just said.
Well, that's what I was thinking about when I was reading this writing of his. But then I was also thinking that then your mother was hired essentially during the Burnham years to develop a kind of national ceramic industry to make this swimming pool for the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister of Guyana at the time decided he wanted an Olympic-sized swimming pool with a map of Guyana on the floor, on the base, but there had to be glazes made in Guyana. It had to be Guyanese clay. So my childhood O-level studies for O-level exams were set an alarm, wake up, do a bit of studying, turn the kiln off. The industrial kiln. So I was an unpaid factory worker. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Post-colonial history, boy. Sometimes it's weird and messy.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. Okay.
Thank you. Hello. Well, that's loud. I've got a question about the Caribbean. And how Donald's work maybe opens out to the Caribbean. I was really interested in how, in thinking about the Caribbean as this archipelago, this bridge between the Americas, and thinking about when, Hew, you were talking about Donald squinting and almost seeing Guyana in the buildings of Atlanta and in the South. And it made me think about the repeating island, and Antonio Benitez Rojo's idea that the Caribbean repeats from island to island, each time slightly different, and then it proliferates out to the world, and Caribbeanness reroutes itself here. And yet within that mix, within that complex ebb and flow of the archipelago, Guyana is unique, right? Because it's part of the mainland, and yet it has a kinship with the island. So I was curious to hear, we got a hint of it in the quote about the relationships with other, or feeling a sense of Caribbeanness coming through his work. But I wondered if there was any way in which any of you wanted to speak to the connections between his work and the rest of the archipelago,
Okay.
or the rest of the region, if that makes sense.
What I'll say about that, quite brief, is right now it may have come to an end, but CariFesta, Caribbean Festival of Arts, is just finishing in Barbados. Now I remember, I won't sing because I've got a terrible voice, but 1972 CariFesta, the first one was in Guyana. And that was the first time I realized that we were linked to the Caribbean culturally. And my dad was there at the time. He was introducing to me to these people and that people and this other people and stuff like that. And that was the first time I realized that there was a connection, a strong connection. And living in London with things like the Caribbean artist movement and stuff like that, I'm not even sure whether my dad was completely, wholeheartedly a member of that. But living in London, you're also you're part of a Caribbean community, and he would have been aware of that. But definitely, for me personally, I first saw it in 1972 when all these people from all over the Caribbean, Suriname, French Guyana even, all rocked up in Georgetown. And it was special. It was really special.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.